For decades, those in power have systematically ridiculed and suppressed evidence of extraterrestrial contact, leaving witnesses isolated, discredited, and afraid. But in January of 2010, on a scorching day in rural Queensland, something breached our world that couldn't be so easily dismissed. What makes James's testimony so dangerous is their disturbing revelation that Earth is just one planet in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. Today's episode brings you two hair-raising eyewitness accounts that will make you rethink everything about your life. You don't want to miss this one. Around noon on a sweltering day in January of 2010, a man named James was working alone on his property in rural Queensland, Australia. James was in the middle of fixing a section of fence line that had been damaged during the last big storm, and sweat was just pouring down his face as he worked, and every few moments he'd stop to take a quick sip from his water bottle before getting back to it. For James, this was just another ordinary day on his property. He'd been working this land for years, and he had a pretty set routine. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning, make himself some instant coffee, and then drive his old pickup truck out to whatever part of the property needed attention that day. And on this particular morning, he'd driven all the way to the far corner where a section of fence had come loose. And as James worked, he was thinking about calling his daughter later that evening because her birthday was coming up next week and he needed to figure out what gift to send her. And one of the challenges of living so far out in rural Queensland was the spotty cell service. I mean, even now, glancing at his phone sitting in his truck, he could see it was showing just one bar at best. But James actually liked the isolation out here. It was just him and the occasional kangaroo hopping by. There was no traffic, no neighbors, no noise, really just the sounds of nature and his own thoughts. And as he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he happened to glance up at the sky, and there, hovering in the sky, appeared to be what looked like a second sun. And for a moment, he kind of just stood there squinting, thinking maybe it was some kind of reflection or maybe a mirage from the heat. And, he rubbed his eyes, wondering if maybe the heat was getting to him more than he had realized. But when he looked again, that second sun was still there, and it was moving. Unlike anything natural, this object was slowly drifting across the sky. And as he watched completely still with the fence repair tool still in his hand, he realized this was now moving in his direction. And he noticed something else too. That it was changing from a golden yellow color to a deep red as it got closer to him. He wasn't exactly scared yet, more just completely bewildered by what he was seeing. Now that it was closer, James could see that this thing was a perfect sphere. It was like someone had painted a big red ball and kind of just hung it in the sky. Everything around him went silent, and this sphere suddenly accelerated. It moved directly toward James with incredible speed, and before he could even think about running, it stopped abruptly, hovering about 20 feet away from where he was standing. James could actually feel heat radiating from this sphere. It wasn't like the heat from a fire. It was more like the feeling you get when, you stand near an electrical transformer. And the air around him smelled slightly metallic, similar to how it smells right before a lightning storm hits. Feeling on the verge of nearly collapsing from anxiety, he didn't feel the urge to run away. It was like his feet were kind of glued to the ground, and he glanced down at his watch to check the time, thinking maybe he should note exactly when this was happening. But his watch stopped working completely. The second hand wasn't moving at all. Then something even stranger happened. A wave of calm suddenly washed over James. It felt like being wrapped in a warm blanket, and all the fear and panic he just felt just melted away, replaced by an intense curiosity about what he was seeing. Now, he knew this wasn't a natural feeling. He could recognize that something was affecting him, making him feel like this. It was like being given a strong sedative, but without losing any mental clarity. Even though he knew this artificial calm wasn't normal. He couldn't fight against it. His breathing slowed down and all his muscles relaxed. And he just stood there in this strange state of artificial calm. One side of the sphere began to change right in front of him, and it was like he was watching glass, red glass, melt away. And a perfect circular doorway formed in the side of the sphere, extending all the way down to the ground. Intense white light poured out from inside, but not blinding, but definitely much brighter than the sunlight around him. A sudden wave of dizziness just hit him, and it felt like all the blood was rushing to his head at once. He actually had to reach out to steady himself against the fence post he'd been working on just moments earlier. And then, two tall figures emerged from the doorway of the sphere. They were walking casually, almost like they were just taking a stroll through a park. Now, his first thought was that this must be some kind of military test aircraft. Maybe the Australian Air Force or even the Americans were testing something out here in the remote outback. The figures appear to be wearing blue uniforms that looked similar to Air Force attire. James quickly glanced around, half expecting to see cameras or other witnesses, but there was just him, these two figures, and the sphere. As they got closer, James noticed their unusual height. They had to be at least 7 feet tall, and their movements were just too fluid and too perfect. There was something off about how they walked. What he had initially thought were uniforms weren't actually made of fabric. Looking closer, it seemed like the blue covering was somehow part of their skin. One of them had short blonde hair and the other had light brown hair, but their faces looked too perfect. It was kind of like mannequins or CGI characters from a movie. Their eyes were this bright blue that seemed to glow slightly, and they were both smiling in a way that was simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. And James then heard a voice clearly say, "Don't be afraid, please follow us." And the shock came when he realized neither of their mouths had moved. The voice seemed to be coming from inside his own head. Now, he tried to speak, but his mouth was completely dry. And after a moment, he managed to ask who they were, but got no immediate answer. Despite now knowing with absolute certainty that these beings were not human, he felt strangely compelled to follow them. It wasn't exactly mind control, he would explain later on, but more like this overwhelming sense of trust that he just could not resist. And so he glanced back at his truck where his phone was sitting in the cup holder, and he thought briefly about making a run for it, but come on, who's he gonna call? And every time he hesitated about following them, that calm would just intensify, and it would almost kind of drown out his thoughts. And so he just followed them toward the doorway of the strange craft, and as he approached the doorway, he realized it functioned like some kind of elevator, that the floor beneath him began rising smoothly upward into the sphere. And there was no mechanical sound at all, just this smooth upward movement. Once he was inside, he noticed that the temperature was perfectly comfortable, neither hot nor cold. It was a pretty stark contrast to the scorching Queensland heat that he'd just been standing in. The light inside seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There were no visible light fixtures, but the entire interior was bathed in this soft white glow. He also noticed a faint smell in the air, like rain hitting hot pavement. And so, he's looking around and he saw that the walls looked like burnt glass or obsidian, black but somehow translucent at the same time. The floor was made of the same material, but felt completely solid under his feet. There were no visible seams or joints anywhere that he could see. Everything kind of just flowed together perfectly in one piece. He couldn't see any obvious technology either. There were no buttons, screens, or controls of any kind. The room was perfectly circular with a domed ceiling above. Inside, there were also several other beings present, both male and female figures, all wearing the same skin-tight blue uniforms. The females had extremely long hair and were strikingly beautiful. Two of them were standing at what appeared to be some kind of control panel, though it had no buttons or switches that James could see. Three others were studying what looked like star charts that seemed to be projected to the wall itself. you had two more who were standing in conversation, though James noticed their mouths weren't moving either. He noticed that these beings could almost pass for humans, if not for some subtle differences. Their proportions were slightly off. They had longer limbs and narrower waists than normal humans. And their movements were too precise and efficient, like they'd been carefully choreographed. And they all had those same bright blue eyes. There wasn't a single visible imperfection on any of their skin. A female figure approached him carrying what looked like folded blue material. Through that same telepathic communication, she had asked James to remove his clothing and put on this uniform. Under normal circumstances, James would have been self-conscious about undressing in front of strangers, but he felt strangely willing to comply. He noticed that every time he went along with their requests, that calming sensation would intensify, almost like a reward. One of the male figures came over and helped James into the uniform. It was a single piece that covered him from his toe all the way to his head. The material felt like nothing on Earth. It was somewhere between silk and rubber. And as soon as he had it on, it seemed to shrink, conforming perfectly to his body. The male demonstrated something about the uniform's neck protection by pressing against it, which, when James watched in amazement, the material instantly hardened when pressure was applied. Technology that was unlike anything he'd ever seen. After James was dressed in this strange uniform, a bench-like seat formed right out of the wall. The female who had given him the uniform sat down and gestured for him to join her. At this point, James decided to just be direct. He asked who they were and what they wanted with him. The female simply introduced herself as Lisa, though James doubted this was her real name. Her voice in his mind was gentle, but had this odd resonance to it, like hearing someone speak through water. And Lisa explained to James that they weren't from Earth. She told him that they came from another galaxy far, far away, see what I did there, that humans hadn't even discovered yet. On their home planet, they were the third from their sun, just like Earth is in our solar system. And she explained that they were harvesting people from Earth-like planets across different galaxies. So you could imagine how surprised James was when she mentioned that people were chosen completely at random, that he had not been specifically targeted for any reason. Then, Lisa made an unexpected offer. She explained that James was being invited to help colonize new planets. She told him they discover about 20 habitable planets daily, and thousands more were in what she called transitional phases. They needed humans to populate these worlds, and James would be sent with others to start a new civilization. So as James sat there just trying to process this information, Lisa launched into what seemed like a rehearsed explanation about planetary evolution. She explained their view that Mercury was once Earth-like before moving too close to the sun. Venus was once in Earth's position. Eventually, Earth would become uninhabitable like Venus, and Mars would move into the habitable zone and become the new Earth. Now, according to Lisa, this cycle happens throughout the entire universe. She explained that the terms of this invitation came with a critical warning. That James would be sent to a mostly barren planet, but he wouldn't be alone. There would be others from Earth that would join him. They would be provided with limited tools, but there would be no modern comforts like what we're all used to here on Earth. And then came the most important part of the warning. If James accepted their offer, he would never see his loved ones again. On Earth, he would simply become another missing person. People would look for him for a while, but eventually they would give up and life would go on without him. After explaining all of this, Lisa offered James a choice: go with them or return to Earth. If he chose to return, his memory of the entire encounter would be erased. James just told her that he needed time to think about such a massive decision. Lisa seemed to understand and just told him that he had one day while they collected more Earthlings. He would be moved to another sector of the craft while he considered his options. And so James spent hours thinking about Lisa's offer. It was tempting in some ways, the chance to see other planets, to be a part of building a new civilization, but then he thought about his family and even his daughter. Her birthday was coming up, and he thought about all the birthdays he would end up missing out on, all the moments in his life and her life that he would never get to see. And eventually, James made his decision. He couldn't leave his family behind, no matter how incredible of an opportunity this was. So when Lisa returned, he just told her he wanted to go back to Earth. She didn't seem surprised or disappointed. It was like she had expected this answer all along. So they led him to what appeared to be a changing area. James changed back into his regular clothing. His work shirt was still damp from sweat from earlier in the day. And as he handed back the blue uniform, he asked about the memory erasing process, wondering if it would hurt. Lisa just explained that he wouldn't feel anything, and she led him to the center of a completely different room, and so he stood there, and the floor beneath him began to soften. It was like standing in wet sand that was slowly giving way, and he sank down until only his head remained above floor level, the strange material molding around his body and holding him firmly in place. A male figure approached, holding a device that resembled an electric razor. There were no blades on it, just a smooth metallic surface that gave off a slight humming sound. And he waved this device directly over James's head, kind of moving around in a circular pattern. Everything went dark. The next thing James knew, he was standing exactly where he had been before, right next to the fence line on his property. The sphere was gone, the landscape around him was unchanged, his tools were still on the ground, his truck was still parked where he'd left it. But something was wrong. He remembered everything. Immediate panic set in, and James spun around, looking up at the sky, searching for any sign of the sphere. Would they realize their mistake and come back for him? What would they do when they uncovered that he still had all his memories? Now his heart was beating out of control, and the artificial calm that had overcome him was gone. So he ran to his truck, fumbled with his keys, desperate to just get away from the area. And once he got the truck started, he began driving off, and he kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see that red sphere following him. And suddenly, the scene shifted dramatically. James was no longer in his truck. He was actually lying flat on his back on some kind of stretcher. He was completely naked and could not move his arms or legs at all. The strange thing was, there were no visible restraints holding him down. He simply couldn't move, like his body wasn't responding to his brain's commands. And out of the gloom, or blurriness, whatever you want to call it, 3 humanoids appeared and were moving him down a long hallway. The walls, ceiling, and floor all appeared to be made of that same dark glass material that he'd seen inside the sphere. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but his mouth would not open. He could only move his eyes, just taking in his surroundings as they wheeled him along. The stretcher glided down the hallway until they reached an oval-shaped room. And once inside, the stretcher itself began to change shape. It molded into this upright position so that James was now partially sitting up, though still unable to move. Lisa appeared in the room, holding James's clothing neatly folded. She placed them on a surface that had formed out of the wall next to the stretcher. Through that same telepathic communication, she explained that they had been unable to safely erase his memory. Apparently, this happened with some humans, and they didn't understand why. And he realized they must have recaptured him almost immediately after dropping him back on his property. He had no idea how much time had passed. It could have been minutes or days, and Lisa moved closer, placed her hand near James's head. Not quite touching him, suddenly he could move again. The paralysis that had been holding him completely still was gone. James immediately sat up, reaching for his clothing and frantically putting them on while Lisa watched with that same unnerving calmness. Once he was dressed, Lisa explained that they wanted to study him to solve this memory problem. She told him that they would return him to Earth for now, but they wanted his permission for periodic testing. In exchange for his cooperation, they offered to take him on journeys across galaxies and to other planets, places no human had ever seen before. They promised he wouldn't be harmed during any of these tests or journeys, and James asked how often they would want to take him. She just explained it would be random, sometimes weeks between visits, sometimes months. They would simply appear and take him, and then return him at the exact moment they had removed him from Earth. To everyone else, it would be like he had never left at all. James never revealed whether he accepted Lisa's offer or not. When he finished telling Albert Rosales his story, he simply just looked off in the distance for a moment and then said what he had shared was only a small portion of the entire experience. The experience I just shared with you was originally shared with author and researcher Albert Rosales, where it was featured in his 2010 to 2015 Humanoids Encounters database. James went on to further explain that there are things he's seen that he can't talk about, places that would be impossible to describe using our English language, because some experiences just don't translate to words. The truth, as James says, might be too extraordinary for most people to believe, or perhaps too disturbing. Either way, he seems content with his role as the man who remembers what others forgot. Folks, his entire story, his experiences, the sphere, the people, Lisa, it all remains a mystery. In the spring of 1980, a 20-year-old girl, Stephanie, was sitting in her family's kitchen in Phoenix, Arizona. It was a Sunday afternoon, circa March or April, around 5 o'clock. Stephanie was at the kitchen table with her dad and baby brother, who was only a few months old. Her father was catching up on some paperwork from work, and her baby brother was sitting in one of those portable car seats that had been placed on the kitchen table. She was sitting there, keeping an eye on her little brother while her dad worked. The rest of the family was at Mass. It was just the three of them at home. The Salazar family lived in a neighborhood called Maryville, which at the time was on the western edge of Phoenix in Arizona. Beyond their neighborhood were just farms and orange groves and cotton fields. And their house sat at the top of a T intersection, so it was visible from 3 different streets. The family had actually moved there in 1972 when they realized they needed a bigger house as the family was growing. It was a relatively boring afternoon though, because not much was really happening, and Stephanie was waiting for her family to get back from church. Without any warning whatsoever, there was this tremendous explosion-like sound, and it seemed to be coming from the other side of the kitchen wall. The sound was so loud that it was deafening. The walls of the kitchen and dining room were physically shaking. The baby immediately started crying. The dad jumped to his feet, and Stephanie just froze and looked around, expecting to see debris falling or something. And just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. For a moment, nobody said anything. The kitchen was still and silent, and except for the baby crying. And she looked at her dad and asked, "What was that?" And of course, the dad's looking really concerned, and he began to quickly move over to the walls and was studying them and intently looking for cracks or damage. He was deep in concentration for several brief moments before he even responded to Stephanie asking what happened. He kind of just backed away and turned to her and explained that it sounded like a mortar shell. And he would know because he had served in the Army 3 different times. They were both thinking the same thing. Something must be damaged somewhere. So the dad put down his paperwork and said they should check outside. The dad grabbed the baby from the car seat, and they all headed outside to the side of the house where the kitchen was. Stephanie expected to see a damaged wall, maybe even a hole or something because of the sound of the blast, but there's nothing. The exterior walls looked normal. There wasn't even a crack in the dining room window. They checked the entire yard, looked at the shed, even looked up at the roof. Nothing was out of place. Even their dog in the backyard was acting normal, not even remotely startled. And so nobody could figure it out. They went back inside and searched room by room. There were no fallen pictures, no broken glass, no cracks, nothing that would explain this tremendous sound they had just heard. And she was thinking maybe a car crashed nearby. Her dad was thinking about a possible gas explosion, but their home was all electric. No gas lines that could explode. But the confusion was mounting with every normal thing they found. And as they stood in the living room just trying to figure out what had happened, something caught the father's attention through the front window. Stephanie, who was now looking in the direction of her father, saw it too and walked to where her dad was standing. People were walking toward their house from all directions. And it wasn't just one or two neighbors, it was dozens of people. They were coming from all three streets that formed the T intersection where their house sat. Some were running, others were pointing at the Salazar house. Everyone looked concerned or frightened. Stephanie and her father quickly rushed outside and stepped onto the front lawn. Neighbors kept coming, all heading straight for their house. "Is everyone okay? We heard the explosion. We thought your house might have blown up," they just explained to them. And it became very clear that everyone within blocks had heard the same mysterious explosion. They all thought it had come from the Salazar house. But the strange thing was, the house was completely undamaged. As perplexing as the situation was, this entire mob was now ready to get to the bottom of it. Many of them joined in on the search. They checked under the house, they looked in the attic, they examined the electrical box, they looked for signs of an impact in the yard, but folks, nothing unusual was found anywhere. Everybody was baffled by this, and gradually, neighbors began to disperse, all of them confused and unsure what had happened. Eventually, Stephanie and her father had to come to terms with the fact that there appeared to be no physical signs of where this sound had come from. They both went back inside, and the father just returned to his paperwork. Stephanie was now getting kind of hungry and heated up some leftovers, so the rest of the day proved uneventful. Now, when the rest of the family returned from Mass, Stephanie and her father explained to them what had happened, but nobody had an explanation, and so life just returned to normal. Moving ahead to December of 1997, so 17 years later, just a few days before Christmas, Stephanie was at the Metro Center Mall in North Phoenix with her 3 small children and a close friend. If you guys know anything about how crazy malls get during the holidays, well, this was that. Just packed with holiday shoppers, and you had Christmas music blasting through the speakers overhead. Jingle bell, jingle bell, jingle bell. Total overstimulation. And, visually, the entire place is just decorated with massive Christmas trees and giant ornaments hanging from the ceiling. And so Stephanie had invited her friend along specifically to help her manage the kids while she tried to finish up her Christmas shopping. With 3 young children, shopping anywhere was challenging, but during the holiday season at one of the biggest malls in Phoenix, well, it was practically impossible to do it alone. And so when they first arrived at the mall, Stephanie had paid a few dollars to rent one of the mall's strollers. It was just a standard metal-framed stroller with a plastic seat that wasn't particularly comfortable, but it did the job. Stephanie and her friend had spent several hours going from store to store, up and down levels of this massive 2-story mall. They'd bought gifts, the kids had seen Santa, and now everyone was getting pretty tired. Stephanie's youngest was fussing in the stroller, and her other children were dragging their feet, asking when they could go home. Stephanie decided it was finally time to wrap up their shopping, and the group headed toward one of the mall exits on the 2nd floor where there was a stroller return area. From where they stood, Stephanie could see a sports store directly behind the stroller return. She could see the cashier working at the register, ringing up customers. And there was a man walking on the opposite side of the open mall area, and plenty of other shoppers moving about. Stephanie approached the stroller return mechanism, ready to slide the stroller back into place and head home. She knew exactly what to expect, right? The familiar metallic click as the locking mechanism engaged, and it's really not that loud. But when Stephanie slid the stroller into that return mechanism, instead of hearing that metallic click, there was this absolutely deafening explosion. It was so loud, Stephanie could literally feel the sound waves passing through her body. It seemed to come directly from the stroller return device right in front of her. She was momentarily disoriented, her ears ringing, and the time around her just kind of slowed down. Her very first instinct was to immediately check on her children. Were they okay? Had they been hurt? And her children were just as startled. They were crying clearly shaken from the noise, and Stephanie looked up and met her friend's eyes, who was also filled with the exact same shock and confusion that Stephanie was feeling. But there was also visible fear in her friend's expression. Both women were frantically looking around, trying to understand what had just happened. Was that a gun? Is someone shooting in the mall? What is going on? And as they're checking their surroundings, both women could plainly see that they weren't the only ones who had heard it. The cashier in the sports store directly behind them had instantly ducked behind the counter. He was looking under his register as if searching for the source of the sound. The man walking across the open mall area had stopped dead in his tracks and turned back toward where the sound had come from. And some shoppers nearby had completely frozen in place. Others had begun running away from the area, panicking, thinking there was a shooting. But strangely, some people just continued their shopping as if nothing had happened, which made the whole scene even more confusing. Now, the weirdest part was that there was no visible source for this explosion. There was no smoke, the stroller return mechanism showed no damage, nothing had been visibly disturbed, there was no announcement coming over the mall's PA system, and no security personnel were rushing to the scene. So Stephanie just looked at her friend and asked her if she had heard that, and she immediately confirmed that yes, she had, and it sounded exactly like a gunshot. Completely unnerved by all of this and not knowing what else to do, she quickly gathered her children, grabbing her youngest from the stroller, and the entire group hurried toward the nearest exit. And as they walked, Stephanie kept looking back over her shoulder, kind of just scanning for any signs of danger or an explanation for what had just happened. She kind of expected something to happen at any given second, but nothing did. In fact, the mall seemed to be operating normally. There was nothing to indicate that anything unusual had occurred. It was as if only certain people had experienced whatever that sound was, while others had been completely unaffected. And when they finally reached Stephanie's car in the parking lot, they all piled in, and Stephanie locked the doors immediately. As she started the car, she and her friend just exchanged looks. Neither of them could make sense of what had just happened. Both were certain of what they'd heard. And so later that evening, Stephanie had gotten all her children fed, bathed, and tucked into bed, and she still couldn't stop thinking about the incident. Deciding that she needed to get down to the bottom of this, she called the mall's security office because someone there must know what had happened. Maybe there had been some kind of mechanical failure with the stroller return that caused the explosive sound, or maybe there had been some kind of security incident that was quickly contained. We don't know. Whatever it was, she just wanted an explanation. So when the security office answered, she explained calmly and matter-of-factly exactly where she had been in the mall and what time the incident had occurred. She described the incredibly loud gunshot-like sound and how there were multiple people who had reacted, but the security officer's response left Stephanie even more confused. He simply told her that there had been no incidents reported anywhere in the mall that day. No emergency calls had been received, and there was no record of any disturbance of any kind. He just suggested to her that, lady, perhaps you just heard some construction noise from somewhere else in the mall. It was just one loud, incredible bang. It didn't sound anything like construction or equipment or anything like that. But he just maintained his stance, and she never did get closure. Now, to this day, Stephanie still can't explain what happened with the strange explosions. Was it some kind of supernatural event, a glitch in reality, an acoustic anomaly unique to that building, or maybe something else entirely? She doesn't know, and I don't either, and she probably never will. Makes you think that, how do you wrestle with these things in your mind when they don't leave any physical evidence? Unfortunately, the events that happened to her will remain a mystery. And because you made it to the end, I want you to all comment below, you're not crazy. So that way, I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural in a cinematic storytelling fashion, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.